Hi, this is a conversation with Elena Panaritis. She is a policy innovator, social entrepreneur, and economist. And Elena, you have participated around the world in processes of reform and innovation.
Correct.
And also in processes of crisis. Can you share with us, what's your experience on the role of the leader and the leadership in situations of crisis and situations of reform? Maybe it's two completely different things, but let's begin there.
The fact that there has been a crisis shows that there has not been leadership before, okay? Because crises are supposed to not happen if you actually have a visionary leader that can anticipate them, establish necessary reforms to overpass and evolve the community and the economy at a space that allows to overcome a possible crisis, all right?
And you have been involved in UFM in a course on leadership and crisis.
Correct. We spent 3 days with executive thought leaders and action leaders of Guatemala to explain what is the skill set necessary that private sector leaders and public sector leaders need to have in order to preempt and avoid a crisis, in order to create innovation, and that's the best way to avoid a crisis. You innovate, right? And you evolve the community, and you lead the community to go over that space. And we have had also a very exciting time in having the participants engage in their own definition of how to do that specific reform, if you want to call it, or transformation, which is actually the better word. So we have these case studies that we go through, negotiations when you're in an economy of a crisis, or devise a leadership model where in one specific sector or trend of the economy, the specific leader wishes to do a change in the trend.
And is it possible to identify who are the most dangerous enemies of reform? I mean, I guess that it's different in every case, but is it possible to identify?
Yeah, of course. So the reason why we get to a crisis, which is sometimes a good thing, you have to break, the vicious cycle. So a vicious cycle is generated by special interests. And the special interests and then leaders, I would put them in quotation marks, decision makers that prefer to keep happy the special interests, so they take decisions that keep the special interests happy, then the special interests are returning the favor by keeping the decision makers in place. So you have this vicious cycle. And then there is one point that you may have visionary people that go to the decision makers and tell them, but don't you see, this is not gonna last for too long. This is gonna break. And they go like, well, not in my lifetime. Maybe in the next generation or 2 generations down the road. But so there is this kind of denial. So this denial is fed with the beneficiaries of the special interests that happen to be the two poles of holding back any type of wanting to do the change. In which case, a crisis is the best opportunity for change and transformation. It's an unfortunate best opportunity because a crisis generates a lot of unemployment, generates a lot of discontent, generates a lot of poverty, generates a breakdown of the community. So we don't really wish to be in crisis. It's not something that anybody would like to be in. That's why a lot of my job is to anticipate it. So I've worked in many countries trying to anticipate a crisis. But of course you have to recognize that if you don't have a visionary leadership that understands that needs to break that vicious cycle, no matter what you say, they will never anticipate it. Yeah? So unfortunately, we are right now in the European Union Euro crisis. I've been working with them for the last 7 years. I think there is still a wishful thinking that there isn't really a vicious cycle. There isn't really a way to change, because it's only a matter of making better that decision makers, helping special interests, and special interests, of course, returning the favor.
Is there a relationship between leadership and entrepreneurship?
Oh, big time. Huge relationship. The leader is an entrepreneur of its own, and is a lonely entrepreneur because he's an innovator. So a leader who is a visionary leader usually sees ahead of others, right? So he has to have a charisma, he has to trust himself, so he has to have very strong leadership skills, which means that he has to have knowledge, in-depth knowledge of history, serious knowledge of specific sectors, how they work, open with a width to want to learn more, right? And constantly innovating his knowledge base. So I'm going to give you an example of one specific leader that I found recently. Gurion, who, when he was in Israel, at the age of 70, he was learning ancient Greek, and so that he could read in the original Homer. And he was learning Latin so he could read Dante. And that was the most important thing he thought he had to do, so he could keep on evolving. So one example of a leadership, right? So would be to see Gurion, the leader of the creation of Israel, where in the age of 70, he started learning, reading in its original language, Homer and Dante. So he had to study the original languages of ancient Greek and original connected modern Italian, so the important element here is that you constantly keep it up. There is no such a thing, oh, well, I learned, I went to university, I'm now 60 years old, that's it. No, you learn all the time. And you have to be up on your feet all the time. And you have to be updated all the time. And you have to be updated ahead of the masses, of the people. So a leader is an innovator by definition, and an entrepreneur by definition. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs can be entrepreneurs in the private sector or in the public sector in a small space. But then there is a different type of an entrepreneur, which is the social entrepreneur. And that entrepreneur is the one that is engaging with the common good and connects the private with the public for the evolution of the next stage of the community. It's not always very successful because these type of skills are very few that have it. Of course, it becomes very sexy. A lot of people want to be social entrepreneurs, right? But it is a way to engage the private and the public skill set, right, of how to actually lead a community, lead an economy, lead a sector.
In your experience around the world, Elena, have you ever had an extraordinary moment in which you say, wow, this is happening the way it's supposed to be happening, and I'm so happy about this?
Oh yeah, lots of wow moments, aha. I was engaged in the transformation of the terrible crisis in Latin America in the 80s. In one country was Peru, right? And of course, you know that if you do the correct transformation in theory, right? If you do the correct transformation, middle class increases, poverty is being reduced, child labor is being reduced, women and minorities are more involved in the civic society. And you know what? I saw this happening. And I wish a lot of economists would have had that it's a miracle. It's an extraordinary feeling to be able to be in the designing, in the implementation, and in the actual experiencing of the change. And that was amazing. So Peru, for example, was a dying country, 60% poverty. They had waves of cholera, no electricity, no water. Very, very impoverished country because of huge level of crisis, meltdown, that's what it was. And suddenly, in less than in one generation, their middle class grew tremendously from 1 million to over 10. Everybody is not just graduating from elementary school or high school, they're going to university. So you go now, 10 years later, to a country, or 20 years now, but when I was going afterwards to check what was going on, and a taxi driver who before was not reading, now is stopping at a red light, which was not existing before, so now there is a red light. He's stopping at the red light, and he has a newspaper and reads a newspaper in the 20 seconds of the red light. He reads a newspaper. I'm like sitting there thinking, I can't believe I've seen this change. It's amazing.
On the other hand, have you ever seen failure?
Oh, yes. Well, we're living now in a failed reform or transformation of the Euro crisis. This is the latest one. Of course, I've seen other failures. You know, Venezuela is another failure. Argentina has been another failure. The failure occurs when the reform does not touch the behavioral changes, which means that not touch the agreements on which a country is based. And what is best than establishing secure ownership rights, property rights? That's when you have success. And when you establish agreements of justice. So for instance, if you take a case to the court and it takes you 20 years, you are denied justice, right? So if you have so much bureaucracy. And if you're not able to prove that the property you own, the house you own is yours, right? That's also an inability of you to grow out of a crisis, out of stagnating poverty. So that's definitely the case in the countries I mentioned in Latin America. But in Europe, we notice a failure in wanting to accept that the system we're dealing with right now is not producing wealth, is not generating income, is not producing growth. And instead of trying to identify why is it not producing growth, who are the beneficiaries and the vested interests that really keep the system as it is? Because probably they have a rent, but the community, the world doesn't, the countries don't. Instead of doing that, unfortunately, we're sitting around trying to perfect the broken system. Yeah. Let's have more meetings. Let's have more summits. And let's talk more about the broken system and how can we actually make it less broken. But it's like a system that does not work. So I'm not surprised in a way that, you know, we had the Brexit. And I'm not surprised that we have Euroscepticism. And I'm not surprised that we have racial distinctions and people become more racist and people become more separatists and people become more reactionary in behaviors that are not European, right? And I'm not surprised because I've seen crisis and, you know, right before the final burst, all of what you see is exactly this: separatism, skepticism, lack of trust, lack of confidence. Not an environment that is friendly to investments. Instead, an environment that is enemy to its own people. So you see lots of Europeans leaving, lots of Greeks leaving.
Elena, if a student approaches you and asks, would you recommend me a website, a book, an essay on leadership, what would you recommend?
Okay, I would of course recommend the book I wrote, which is called Prosperity Unbound, Building Property Markets with Trust, with a foreword by Francis Fukuyama. It's a small book, and it's rather well written because it's kind of like reviewed by 27 different reviewers for distinct audiences. So it's kind of easier for people to understand because it explains the historical evolution of economic development paradigms after the Second World War and why we're stuck and how can we actually transform that change. The second thing would be the last two volumes of Francis Fukuyama on political power and leadership they're really very good to understand, again, the evolution and why. It's important to understand the evolution. If you don't understand the way things operate and grow, you don't really know why they're stuck. So that's an important one. And then, of course, I would suggest that people go to thoughtforaction.org. It's our website. And we have on that website events that present the best practices of unstuck crisis. New Zealand, Britain, Peru. Also, how innovation can define growth in a space of crisis. So there is a lot of, an anthology of a lot of best practices and sharing. I would think that would be a good way to start.
Thank you, Elena, for sharing these experiences and ideas with us. And thank you too.